Welcome to Mormon Book Reviews, where an evangelical encounters the restoration. I'm your host, Steven Pynakker, and I'm very excited about my guest that I'm having on today. We're actually talking about a new translation of the New Testament for Latter-day Saints. But before we get there, just want to remind you that this month's book drawing is Unexpected, the backstory of finding Elizabeth Smart and growing up in the culture of an American religion by Chris Thomas. He was in the foreword by Elizabeth Smart, and he was the family spokesman when Elizabeth went missing. It's a fantastic book. Of course, we've had him on already. He was nice enough to send me 2 copies, so we'll be giving away 2 copies. So make sure in the description you go to my email, mormonbookreviews@gmail.com, and make sure that in the description, the subject heading, you say book drawing, you leave us your name and your address, U.S. residents only. This will probably go through May 31st will be the deadline unless I decide to extend it out. So check that out. All right, Thomas Wayment of BYU. You recently, now this is the second edition, and we're going to talk about the first edition and then the revised edition of the New Testament. And I want to thank my friends at Greg Calford Books for sending me this, and Lloyd in particular. Really appreciate my relationship that I have with you guys. And I really appreciate the relationship I've been able to develop with you recently by reaching out and having conversations and getting to know you. And Tom, I'm thrilled to have you on the program. Welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me, Stephen.
So I really enjoyed, by the way, you could also watch, he did a good interview with my friend Rick Bennett on Gospel Tangents as well. So check out that interview as well. And I watched that. And then Lloyd sent me a copy of this, and I was going through this, and actually I was impressed by this edition, and I'm really excited to talk about that. But before we get there, I want us to actually talk a little bit about your past, Thomas. First of all, maybe give us a little background about where you were born, how you were raised, and then we're going to talk about what led you into the academic world, the scholarly world, and ultimately what led you to do this translation of the New Testament. So, Thomas, let's start at the beginning. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm from a very kind of long Latter-day Saint family that were farmers, dairy farmers, and my dad couldn't stand it. He didn't enjoy dairy farming and went to dental school, as many Latter-day Saints do. And I was really raised in California. So I have these farm roots, and my dad growing up raising us kids in California. And I come from a family of 7. I'm the second oldest, and from my earliest memories, I really thought I wanted to be an archaeologist. That was like the thing that sounded so fun to me. And I think I hit this point where, when I was in high school, where I realized, yeah, I don't really know anything about this. I don't really think I could do that. And so I kind of let it go aside. And when I turned 19, as many Latter-day Saints do, I went on an LDS mission to Italy. And you can imagine this kind of brings back all of these things I'm feeling as a young kid, and just obsessed with, and for those of you who don't know, Mormon missions, they have a day dedicated where you can go see sites and you can do cultural things called the P Day, preparation day. And I literally would see every single ancient site that was available. And it really got this interest going in me again. And so fast forward, I come home from my mission and I go to UC Riverside and I enroll in a pre-dental program. I was a chemistry major, and I took, for my elective, this was my big mistake, I took Greek. And I had literally one of the most fascinating professors I've ever had to this day. His name was Howard Jackson. And I could not get enough of what he had to say. His class was so exciting. And I don't know why it was, but just for me, it was everything. And I loved that class, and I hated my chemistry and physics. And I decided, unbeknownst to my wife, about mid-second year, that I couldn't go through with this chemistry thing and be a dentist like my dad. He was like, come join the practice. And I thought, oh, that'd be great. But in the end, I just didn't enjoy it. And I started taking Latin, and declared as a classics major. My wife was, eventually happy about that, but I had decided, I don't know what I'll do for a career. My family isn't an academic family, in the sense there's some professional schooling, but I didn't have an uncle or anything aunt that had been a professor. And so I was really unaware of this pathway. And this Greek professor would talk to me after class, and he would say, you ought to consider graduate degree. And like many Latter-day Saints, there's a sense, and this is where I start to see some of my real development happening. For I don't know if you've encountered this idea before, Stephen, but there's an idea that Latter-day Saints, when they're going after history or Greek or Latin or these ancient topics, that they're kind of going after history of the saints. There's an idea that there's a recoverability in antiquity of a, if you will, a Mormon narrative. And I thought I was part of that. I really kind of believe that's where I was going, and I could be part of this work. And so there's a real, I wouldn't have called it at that time, but I see it now looking back at myself, a really kind of strong interest in apologetics, a strong interest in recovering this faith story. And then there's this other kind of, I don't know, instability in the system. And that is that Latter-day Saints have, as we know, a kind of, I hate to say it in a negative way, but a clergy that's not professionalized by degrees. So there's a sense that you think as an academic, you can be part of this. So you could be the professional part, if you will, like other faith traditions have. And so I get accepted into a PhD program in New Testament studies, and I'm, wide-eyed. I'm going to make this difference. I'm going to contribute, and that's really the beginnings of me as an academic. I enrolled at Claremont Graduate University. At the time, it was a top 10 graduate program and produced some really powerhouse scholars. And I was kind of at the tail end of that. Jim Robinson was still there, International Q Project and Nag Hammadi Library and English projects. And I decided to do a dissertation on the Gospel of John and the Gospel of Thomas. And that my dissertation advisor, Greg Riley. And if you ever listen to this, Greg, thanks. He was a wonderful human, a wonderful soul. And I argued that these two early texts, Thomas and John, were in conversation. And that was me. I loved what I did there. And and for many of you, that you'll find this story funny. I had never had any intention of coming to BYU. That wasn't on my radar. I don't have a single family member who attended BYU. And lo and behold, in my second year, there's a student in my class. I didn't know her well, but she was in classes, and these are small classes, 10, 15 students. And she catches me after class one day and says, "Hey, are you a Latter-day Saint?" And I kind of was really taken back, like, what am I doing that makes you ask that? But yes, I am. And she eventually helped navigate an interview here. And I interviewed with Steve Robinson. And probably the thing he said most in that interview is, "We had no idea about you." And I'm like, why would you? I didn't attend BYU, never had stepped foot on campus, rooted against BYU my whole growing up. I'm a diehard Pac-12 person, but the Pac back then, loved UCLA, USC. I know you can't usually like both, but if you like one in basketball, one in football, that's great. And he said, "You know what I'm going to have you do? I'm going to have you meet all the faculty that I can, go buy their books tonight, read what you can, and then meet them tomorrow." And I guess that went well. They brought me out for a summer teaching event, and they had me teach and kind of watched me. And eventually that worked into a job. So that's how I landed here. I landed in BYU religious education. And in my 18th year here, I transferred to classics.
Okay.
And that's where I'm currently at.
So I'm just curious, because you had mentioned at Claremont that somebody said it was involved in something called Project Q. I'm assuming that's Q Quelle Source is
yeah, that's the International Q Project. Jim Robinson was heading that up, but with other scholars that were in residence there. And they were writing the beginnings of the the Hermeneia Q commentary. And it's the largest of the Hermeneia commentary. And it both reconstructs the text as
and real
best.
quick, before you get into that, I actually want you to explain to the audience, what is Q Quelle Source? It's a German word. Explain to them what that is, and then talk about this project, because it sounds very interesting to me.
Yeah, the idea behind Q is that most scholars agree that Mark is the earliest gospel source written, not the earliest New Testament text, but the earliest gospel, and that Matthew and Luke have clearly adopted Mark. There's parts where they're quoting Mark and adapting Mark and fixing Mark. And somebody has this kind of almost mathematical moment where you say, what if you subtract Mark out of Matthew and Luke? What if you take that away from them? What do those two sources look like? And there's roughly 65 sayings that are verbatim between Matthew and Mark. And then I'm sorry, no, between Matthew and Luke. And the question becomes then, how much verbatimness indicates that these two are either copying from one another or another source? And the scholarly theory that was particularly predominant in the 90s and early 2000s was that there was a source called Quella, Q, for the German word source, really innovative there. And the idea is we could recover it. And the arguments were being launched that Luke was more faithful in quoting Q and Matthew more likely to adapt Q. And this project, which literally drew some of the greatest minds of the late 20th century in scholarship, were resident at Claremont, and they were working on this. We would have classes on it. We would come to an evening discussion and kind of hash it out. Why is this in Q? Why is it not? But it was always based on these verbatim passages where Matthew and Luke were put alongside each other. And then it got down to, is and in the source? Or did Luke have to add and to get from saying this saying to that saying? And then we started to look at things like, what's the theology of Q? Like, why would Luke quote that? Why would Matthew? And it's been a very productive scholarly theory. It still has a lot of holding power. And those of you who deal in academia will appreciate, once there is an academic theory out there, really disproving or proving it isn't the end goal. But is it a viable theory? Absolutely. And it tends to not draw as much attention, but still a way we talk about gospel scholarship.
Yeah, and I find that to be, I'm really interested in that subject as well. And I think it's good that we kind of have this conversation because, of course, a lot of modern biblical scholarship influences the translation that you came out. But before we get there, I want to ask a little bit about a little bit more, I guess, when did you actually have this idea about doing something like this? Did people have conversations about like, wow, wouldn't it be interesting if we had a translation of the New Testament for Latter-day Saints? Where did this idea come from? And I know it's a little controversial because, of course, the church relies on the King James Version of the Bible. Yeah. So maybe there's also a little bit, and I didn't realize this. I'd asked you when in our last conversation, if anybody had ever done this from your tradition. You said no. And I said, so you're a trailblazer. So how does Thomas Wayment, who's at BYU and didn't intend on going there, where does he get this idea and why and about having a translation for Latter-day Saints of the New Testament?
So it's pretty straightforward for me. There's several kind of strands. So first of all, for those who are interested in the actual mechanics of translation, the New Testament's a fairly straightforward and easy text to translate. This is, in a sense, it's not the highest quality literature. I don't mean to disparage it, but this is not Plato. This is not Aristotle, and it's written in a Koine Greek, which is the kind of common language of North Africa and the regions where these texts are written, and it's pretty legible. So a scholar like myself, a scholar like any scholar who works in Greek, realizes there's a kind of an immediacy. I could stand in front of most classes, as most scholars could, and sight translate this. Oh, I want to read this passage. We're talking about, say, John 3 or something. And I could say, oh, here's what the Greek says. And so that was happening. I was doing this in my religion classes. The second thing that happens that might be the most influential is that I began to realize that the church has made this major point of emphasis of the Book of Mormon. And when I started at BYU, we did a survey, a colleague of mine, and it was typical that the entering freshman had read the Book of Mormon perhaps one time. So it wasn't even a guarantee that every 19, 18-year-old young a woman or young man that entered BYU would have ever read the Book of Mormon. By 2010, it was 6 times. The same surveys done. And so this influence the church has had, that students are coming in, they've read the Book of Mormon 4, 5, 6 times. They have never read the New Testament. And this is increasingly common to find a student who's like, yeah, I know there's a Hebrew Bible. I know there's a New Testament. I've never read those. I might have read the Gospel of Matthew or Luke 1 and 2. And so while Book of Mormon literacy is skyrocketing, biblical literacy is plummeting. And so I start to do some things in my class where I'm putting up a translation from the King James Version. And as you noted, the Latter-day Saint tradition is very indebted to King James. And my students simply can't decode it. They don't. I ask simple questions like, what is that pronoun? You know, what verb form is that? Because for those of you who don't read King James every day, it has this older English, and my students can't make heads or tails of it. And I was to the point where I was giving quizzes in my classes to help students simply understand, what do these English words say? And it was an abysmal experience. And I think I developed a little bit of frustration. Here's this text I've given so much of my career towards, love the New Testament, still do. And my students, man, it's, oh, whatever, I have to take a New Testament class. This is terrible. It's hard to understand. Those people spoke differently. And they love the Book of Mormon, and they're reading it because it's kind of a modern-ish. It has some King James influence, but it's kind of modern. And I start to say in class, at the beginning of every class, I'm going to give you a modern translation of the text on my slides. You know, I have PowerPoint slides, and I'm talking about Matthew 3, and here we go. And my students are like, so that's so helpful. What's that translation? And I said, well, that's just one I did. And that's probably where I start to find the energy in myself to say, well, maybe I just do that and do it for my classes. And so those are probably the two main things. And sorry for such a long answer, but the third thing is the thing that ever convinces me to publish it. So as you might not know, at BYU, there was a group of people called the Word Cruncher software group. And what they did is they developed a program that you can take any text that's electronic and another text that's electronic and say, tell me where they're the same. And you can do this in really complex ways. So I said, what if you took the entire Book of Mormon, tell me where it's at, what parallels it has in the New Testament. And as I'm translating, I'm writing these notes, this really fascinating thing where I'm finding how the Book of Mormon is using the New Testament. And I have them do that for the Bible as well. But there are some resources published on the Bible and then its appearance in the New Testament, or the Old Testament in the New. I try to avoid calling it the Old Testament, but the Hebrew Bible in the New. And I start to write these notes. And I do that for the Doctrine and Covenants, the Pearl of Great Price. And I start to realize these notes, unbeknownst to me, are really targeting a Latter-day Saint audience to help them realize, where does the Book of Mormon come from textually? You know, I'm not arguing about its translation. I'm not saying anything about the early Joseph Smith effort, but what I'm saying is the language of the Book of Mormon is the New Testament. It's threaded so deeply into its theology, into the way it structures narrative. And I write that in my notes. I'm being completely honest. I'm being completely transparent. If the New Testament is quoted in the Book of Mormon, I note it. And I start writing these notes. And it's really arrogant to say, but I fell in love with them. I thought, wow, this could help. They could help in the classroom. They could help my colleagues. And so I have these two things going, a translation and notes. And that's where I start to say, maybe there's a pathway to publication.
Okay, now this is really interesting to me now, and it's also because you're engaging the text of the Book of Mormon through a New Testament scholar's lens. Okay, and I find that very fascinating. But you also did this with you actually did this with the Joseph Smith translation as well. So
Yes.
maybe talk a little bit about that, because I'm sure that informed the project as well.
So One of the reasons initially when I talked about my journey is I was involved in the International Q project just as a student. I didn't contribute in any publishing way, but we were in the classrooms and the conversations. And I had been trained, my PhD was one of the biggest things we were being trained on is how to see sources in other sources. We were trying to find Q in Matthew and Luke. And about the same time I'm working on this New Testament translation, they're happening parallel. I start to realize that the Joseph Smith translation is doing some things to the Bible that stand out as peculiar to a Latter-day Saint scholar of the New Testament. And what I mean by peculiar there is it's aware of some textual variants. It knows some, but it misses the big ones, like First John 5:7, really big text variant, or end of Mark textual variant. It doesn't know those, but it knows some ones in Colossians and Matthew 5. And I start to realize, it occurs to me one day in my office, what it knows is it knows 18th and 19th century text variants. It has no idea about the new text variants that we know about today, which number in the tens, if not 100,000. It knows these old ones that have been around since Codex Bezae or whatnot. And I start to think, he's getting this from somewhere. This is happening somewhere. And in some of my work that I publish elsewhere, I argue that Joseph Smith is influenced by a Bible scholar of his day, Adam Clarke. And for those of you who are familiar with that work, I'll say it again, and I've said it a dozen times. I do not think Joseph Smith plagiarized or copied the source. What I think is that he reads this source, or Sidney Rigdon. They do start the moment Sidney Rigdon enters the scene of the translation of the Bible for Joseph Smith. And he starts showing these awarenesses of Adam Clarke. And for Latter-day Saints who work in the tradition, you'll appreciate the translation of the Bible that produced Genesis, that did Genesis 1 through 24, is inherently different than what he does in Matthew. And so I start to say, I think Adam Clarke is part of his process. I don't know if he's reading it to this day. I don't know if he read it, and then the next day he would work on that passage, or Sidney or him would read it, and then they would talk about it and then make the changes to the Bible. But it's always been a really fascinating thing, and a bit destabilizing for the tradition, where Joseph Smith could take a prophetic view of the Bible and say, I have no training in languages. I'm going to take English. I'm going to make the English new. And that says a lot about the way Latter-day Saints view the Bible, that it's subject to prophetic change. And so as a scholar, I thought, wow, this could be interesting to get into. And so I have, and I've published what I think are my preliminary results that, yeah, I think it influenced him in a certain way.
It's fascinating because we also have to take into account this is the time of the Restoration, but also the primitivist restoration within the context of the broader Protestant community as well. And so what we have here is the Sidney Rigdon comes from that tradition, the Stone Campbellite movement. And what's also interesting is that Campbell actually came up with his own translation of the Bible that he was working on. So this idea of like restoration and translation is also an idea that's in the broader world, and it appears to me that Sidney Rigdon is bringing that to the table as well when they're tackling the Joseph Smith translation.
I think so. I've received a lot of pushback in that work, and a lot of Latter-day Saints are frustrated with it. And so for the moment, I've kind of shelved it, and I'll be very transparent with everyone why. I'm not out to destabilize. I'm not out to criticize, but as a scholar, I'll say it and I'll stand behind this. There is no way to take the Greek or the Hebrew manuscripts and produce the Joseph Smith translation. That's not an option. Okay. And so we have to grapple with, well, what is it then? We have to say, well, what is he doing to the text? Because I can't go to the Greek and I can't translate it that way. Now, there's a few places where he's influenced, either by his day or by other sources, to produce a translation that is reproducible. But those are very minor things, like the rearranging of certain verses or the removal of a verse or something. Those are possible because we now know that verse might be textually suspicious. but it's rare. It's very rare. And the majority of the changes clearly look like prophetic insight or commentary, correction, whatever word the kind of theological group want to use, that's fine. But for me, I can't get there. I need,
Okay.
I need to grapple with that. And so that's why it's an interesting scholarly question for me.
Yeah, no, it is fascinating. I don't know if you're familiar with all with Jonathan Neville and his work, the Jonathan Edwards' influence on the translation of the process of the Book of Mormon, which I find very fascinating.
Yeah.
And I like the fact that you guys are faithful members of the church, and you guys are grappling with the text, which I think is actually a very healthy, mature way of looking at bringing like modern scholarship into the picture, because that's kind of the world where the evangelicals are out of too, or a lot of modern biblical scholarship. And I think that is actually, I think it's helpful because it actually shows in many ways that the influences, outside influences on the translation process are very evangelical and very Protestant, and therefore actually makes Mormonism more Protestant and more evangelical from its early roots than people realize, which I actually think is really cool myself.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree. I mean, here's a community that the one outcome of it that's hard for us to deal with nowadays is that, is scripture a kind of prophetic prerogative, or do scholars like myself, and I said that part of my early journey, are we part of the conversation? And if the church were to initiate a new translation into English, but they've commissioned this or purchased copyrights in, say, French or German or some other languages like Portuguese, the question becomes, in English, who will do that?
Yeah.
And would it be under, prophetic guidance or committee or whatnot? But at the end of the day, they're going to come to people who have Greek and Hebrew experience and Aramaic for Daniel and other places. And that's part of who we are. And it's a tension. It's unclear. Could I say, hey, that's wrong in Sunday school? Hey, that translation isn't quite right. And so I always try to keep quiet about that. I'm not there as that person, but it is an interesting tension our tradition faces.
Well, and I like the fact that, the reliance of the tradition, and part of the reliance on the tradition, of course, is the fact that the King James Version of the Bible was produced by a committee. It was produced by some of the top scholars of the day. And so it would not, and this translation is accepted by the church. So I would say that a process that would be similar to what the King James Version translation was done would probably be the way that would be the precedent that one could use within the Latter-day Saint tradition as well, that one could have a committee of top of the line scholars, some of them maybe even outside of the Restoration, contributing to this as well. I think it would be great, because I love, see, that's where I love the inner dialogues that we can have. Like Christopher Thomas is the president of Book of Mormon Studies Association. He's a Pentecostal. I just think that these kind of conversations can be, in these scholarly endeavors, can actually be very helpful in bringing the Restoration into the broader conversation in biblical scholarship, and thus can actually play, not, I don't want to say a missionary role, but a way of doing outreach in a way that I think would be very productive for all parties, and I think it would be great. Everybody would stand to gain something from it as well.
Yeah, we certainly have a lot of capable scholars, both here at BYU, Provo, but elsewhere, that have high levels of skills in these ancient languages, and certainly could produce one. And the question, I often hear Latter-day Saints express it this way: well, what will we do with the fact that the Book of Mormon is written in a kind of KJV light language? It's not full KJV, but it's KJV light. And the church has grappled with that in other languages. Clearly, it's modernizing the translation of the Book of Mormon in European and South American languages, and could do so. But that's out of my league. I'm more trying to navigate this really narrow space of, the Book of Mormon has received a lot of attention in Mormonism, but the King James the Bible has not. And I'm constantly trying to say, hey, what about this text? It's pretty great. There's some great things going on here.
Okay, so I wanted to ask you this: everybody, when they come to do and you said it's a pretty easy, straightforward way to do translation of the especially the Koine Greek and everything like that. I am just curious, Um, what was your translation approach? Now, when you and I had this conversation last week, I had mentioned something like, could this be something that could be considered somewhat like the ESV translation, which has become kind of the favorite modern translation that many even evangelical, especially scholars, really embrace? Would you say it's in that school of thought and tradition? Maybe discuss that.
Yeah, absolutely. My process is by the time I start translating in my early 40s, I've read the KJV my whole life, so I know that's going to be part of my vocabulary inadvertently. So it's something I kind of put on the table there and say needs to be checked. Be careful I don't fall into a kind of KJVism at any point. The second thing I do is I decide that I'm going to translate from the Nestle Aland 28 edition. That's what most translations today are done from.
And explain what that is. Explain to the audience what that is.
It's a text that has its beginnings in the 18th century with a in the United States United Bible Society, in Germany with the Bible Society there. They began gathering all of these various manuscripts throughout the world, and they create a Greek text with an apparatus at the bottom that indicates texts that depart from that. And there's always a question of, how many differences do you put in the footnotes? Because there's a substantial amount, but the idea is broadly defined as the important ones. And so when you're reading and translating the Greek text and following Nestle Aland, you have three things you're looking at. You have the Greek text that we agree this is the closest we have to the original. And then in the margins are all the quotations of where these texts comes from. So when they're quoting Genesis or whatever, and it notes that right there. And in the right column, it tells you, if you're on the left page, in the right column, it tells you how the text was early divided in the early church. There was a chapter here. And then at the bottom of the page, which takes up a half approximately, are all the differences. All of these manuscripts say wherever it came from, this text read a different verb here or a different conjugation of a verb. And so as a translator, you're looking at all these things and translating. So what I decide is I'm going to have to use a bit of an eclectic approach because it's just me. I'm going to translate the Greek text. I'm going to note the left column quotations. Where does this come from? And then I'm going to note all variants in translation in the footnotes that make a difference for the meaning of the text that is significant. And I know that word significant is super loose and it's a problem. And I don't know if you can ever get all of those, but I try for the first time for the Latter-day Saint audience to say, hey, the New Testament isn't as stable as you think it is. And you get in these kind of conversations with, these are the very words of Jesus. A New Testament scholar will always say, comma, but there's a text variant. So which is the original? Which did he mean? And then there's this interesting thing in the Gospels where Matthew gives us a saying of Jesus and Mark does, or Luke, and they're different there. And then we have to deal with, well, what did they think he meant? What did they perceive this author think Jesus meant? And so I wanted to open that up to the reader. And so my process was to translate the Greek in my own kind of way. I read it aloud. I wanted it to be very readable. We don't have a liturgy. We don't have a kind of, if you will, text we read annually. We might do the, Luke 1 and 2 at Christmas. We might, and I would say very underlined might, we might read the end of the Gospels at Easter, but not always. And so I wanted to make it so readable that a young student that's going to be at my BYU class in the next 2 years would say, oh, I can read that one. I can understand that one. And then finally, I read it against a literalist translation, these really clunky kind that have word for word. And so I checked it against that. And then finally, I read against the RSV and ESV. So I'm comparing those as I go. So that's really my process. That's the whole thing.
So ESV and RSV, what do those stand for? Just so the audience can know what that is.
Um, Yeah, English Standard Version, and the RSV is the Revised Standard Version. The RSV is a descendant of the King
King
James
James.
translation, and so it has as a kind of grandparent the King James, but it's very distant. People would appreciate that. And then there's obviously the new RSV, or the NRSV as people call it today. But the ESV is in that family. These are texts that have moved slightly away from literal word order reproduction. King James is almost Greek word order in many places, and except when we get to Paul, then that kind of blows up, but it works in the Gospels. And so yeah, my translation doesn't follow, like, if the Greek verb is at the end of the sentence, I don't produce that. I try to produce a kind of readable Greek, or English rather.
So one of the things I really like, and this is really fascinating because every single page in here essentially has these footnotes, extensive footnotes. But they're also, it's almost, and here you're engaging within, you're also letting the doctrines and covenants inform the text, the JST inform the text, and other Latter-day Saint scriptures. And so you're integrating that, and it's almost at times, can I say it's almost like a commentary at times too? How would you describe your footnoting philosophy?
So one point of clarification, the JST's never really influenced in the English translation, but I put it there in the notes for readers so they'll appreciate it. And sometimes I have to paraphrase it because the JST is connected directly to the King James Version and makes sense only in that environment. And so it is there for the modern Latter-day Saint reader to say, oh, here's what Prophet Joe Smith did to that text. But yes, there is a need to comment, and this is a little uncomfortable space for me, but I'll try to be as transparent as possible. The King James Version of the Bible translates certain Hebrew names peculiarly because they're representing it in the Greek. So, for example, the word Elijah, the name Elijah, comes across in the KJV translation is Elias. And so I've got to explain that to my readers. I got to tell them, hey, there's no one in the New Testament named Elias, and that creates some difficulty. And there's no one named Esaias. That's the way the King James Version writes the name Isaiah. And so, right, this is just a Greek phenomenon. And no, modern translations don't do that really anymore. They don't give us these Greekized spellings. They give us the old ones. Another one that became peculiar is the name James does not appear in Greek. It's the name Jacob every single instance. And so I feel this burden, like I need to speak to the reader so I don't destabilize their process. I need to help them, like, this is what's going on. I give dates for individuals that are known, so that they can be part of it, and help introduce them to the world of Bible study in a modern sense of the word.
Yeah, and just even like Jesus is more closely related to Joshua than so it as well. So yeah, you get the names, and then of course, yeah. So these are all interesting things that one grapples with as a scholar, and also somebody who's comes from a tradition that's more conservative and literal in many of its understandings of scriptures as well. So you got to kind of be in that wade in those waters. But I think it's really important because I think that somebody who has a high view of scripture and is engaging the text, right, and loves scripture, I think is kind of the best people to engage the scriptures, even through a critical lens. You know what I'm saying? Like it's important to be able to have those tools, but also your faith is there too. And so it's kind of like you're on a balancing a little bit. But I also think that's really kind of where those tensions are, is often where the best scholarship is done too, right?
I hope so. I really hope so. There's a lot of criticism of academia today. I'm sure, being part of a conservative culture, you're probably familiar with this, but there's a kind of a description of what's going on in the academy as woke, and that's really bad. And nobody really knows what woke is, but it's everything that's bad. And I think what a lot of outsiders don't understand is the academic enterprise is fully after, like, what can we offer? We appreciate these texts as much as you do. We're not out to get rid of them. We're trying to say, what are we missing? What can we help with? What can we add to this conversation? And so that's really not us trying to ruin things, but yeah, be part of a larger conversation.
Now, originally, the first edition was actually jointly published by BYU and Deseret. Is that correct? Maybe talk a little bit about the first edition, and then we'll talk about the second edition.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first edition was published by a small campus publisher named the RSC, and wonderful folks. If you listen to this, thanks everyone. They treated me so well. And they have a co-publishing agreement with Deseret Book. And the first printing was fun to watch, because I was told that there was an initial request of copies, and the publisher in Salt Lake, Deseret Book, came back and said, hey, you know what? Let's cut that to a fourth. No one will buy this thing. The Latter-day Saint tradition will really not appreciate this. And that one sold out, I believe, in 5 days. And so they have this experience 3 times where they print a number of copies and they're selling out like in a week or 2 weeks. And so they can't keep ahead of it. And it seems like it's going really well. Through that first year of publication, it sold, I think, well. I don't know how amazing compared to other books or anything like that, but I think it caught a lot of people by surprise. And I was hearing a lot of people respond to me directly and saying, thank you so much. I can understand this text now. And I I would say to a lot, there's a lot of great English translations, not, yeah, anyways, at some point, this is a community that's fully unaware of the ESV or the NIV or all of these really great translations. So fast forward, it's been out 3 years at that point, and I have someone come to my office and inform me that there's been a unilateral decision that scripture, apart from the church's official version, what are called the 2013 standard works, cannot be published by BYU any longer. And this will affect Grant Hardy's Book of Mormon. He has a reader's edition of the Book of Mormon. This will affect my translation and a series of other books. And they pulled the copyright and broke the contract with me. And I'm not afraid to tell that story. That's what happened. And I know a lot of people are aware of that story. I just don't know what motivated it. And so I'll be very transparent with everybody listening. I don't know if this was just simply a unilateral decision that I was told because scripture was becoming too commercialized. And there's a sense, that scripture is becoming itself something that we adorn. It has our journal in it. It has, beautiful covers and artwork being put in it. And we're kind of losing the fact that the text is what's driving this. And so they decide we're going to narrow that. And I approached Lloyd Erickson at Koford Books and said, hey, would you be interested? And Lloyd has been absolutely wonderful to work with. He said, yeah, what do you want to do? And I said, well, I'd really like to do a second edition where I revise the notes. This was a one-person project, and I had some errors I wanted to correct. I wanted some adjustments in translation that I'd had feedback on, some great email exchanges with scholars and others who said, hey, I don't love what you did here, or I'm not sure you're clear here. And so I made quite a few adjustments and launched a second edition. And I have no idea how it's doing. I receive, the thing that's most heartening to me is I receive these emails probably once a week from somebody who will say, hey, Professor Wayment, I bought your translation. I love this thing. And the Bible's like coming alive to me. Or I read it in Sunday school, and my Sunday school class was so interested that this made sense finally. And really, as a scholar, you're like, well, that could have happened 100 years ago. There were some great translations, but this is our community growing up, and I hope to be part of it. That's really what the second edition's about.
Yeah, and I just want to thank Lloyd very much for getting me plugged into this. And actually, I get a ton of books, and so I don't feel like I can do justice to all of them. But I spent some time engaging the text, and I liked it. It was very familiar to me, and I want to know just what kind of engagement. Because I've actually talked to Christopher Thomas, and I said, hey, can you find me a New Testament scholar that'd be willing to engage this, and he's really busy. He hasn't gotten back to me, but he said he was going to try to find somebody like somebody from our tradition to engage your text. But have you actually heard from people outside of your tradition, scholars, and gotten feedback from them on this as well?
I have. I did a presentation at a national conference on it. I've had feedback. The challenge for the LDS tradition for me in this is we don't have strong theological positions. And so when we get to areas where we're, say, evangelicals or Pentecostals are going to have a very kind of, marked out approach, we do not have that. It's very rare. And so I think the translation is going to be fairly well received, because I'm not coming at it, if you will, from like, I need to translate, this passage in John 5 in a certain way, because that's the way our tradition uses it. There's just a very, very few of those. And so, yeah, I think the feedback I've had so far have been good. I had a couple scholars who are friends who said, hey, I looked at this passage, and what do you think about this? And that kind of idea. But that's been the extent so far.
Fascinating. Yeah, well, I have a few more questions. Broadly speaking, I want to ask you. I have this chance to have this this New Testament scholar come on my program, and somebody who's done his own translation on his own. I think that's really cool. I wanted to ask. Oh, and by the way, folks, just so you know, there's actually, like, in the footnotes itself, there are at places like he'll have maps, like here. So he does have some illustrations, which I think are helpful too. I mean, I think it's like this is really, I think it's a very user-friendly edition. I think it's for lay people. I think this is probably really great. And then and as a Latter-day Saint, you can also then engage the modern biblical translations, but done within the context of the Latter-day Saint translation. I think this is like for lay people, this is something that would be very useful. And we actually had a conversation about this where you actually have experienced yourself and know and heard that people are using this even on the ward level.
I have, yeah, I've had one ward whose Sunday school president has purchased it for people in the ward, and so hey, that's what you're doing. Yeah, I'm kind of walking a fine line there. I'm not advocating for anything that way, but the Bible's, it feels weird to say this to you, Stephen, because you come from a tradition that really values the Bible, but every time a scholar like myself hears a statement, we need to read the Book of Mormon more, we need to make it more part of it, I know that comes at the cost of the Bible. And our Bible, I worry that Bible literacy, Bible engagement, and really just love of the Bible is shrinking drastically in our tradition. And so I want to be more heuristic. Hey, this is an important text. It's got a lot to say, and those are the notes that I do get from people. Hey, wow, this is really a great text. I can appreciate this more now.
Well, any way we can get people to read more time engaging the Bible, reading the Bible, and is always, I think, a good thing, no matter where you're coming from. I find that I think that's great. I think you're doing a really good work, and I'm really excited about where this leads the future of translation within the context of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And it's interesting because, of course, when you say translation, we also have to grapple with the fact that Joseph Smith was called a translator, but we also have to understand that modern translator and maybe Joseph Smith as translator, they're two very, in many ways, two very different things. Would you agree to that?
100%. His translation methods are something that has received a lot of attention, but the modern scholar has a lexicon open, a grammar. There's no hat, there's no seer stone. That all of that stuff is really, that's not what we do. That's not to criticize that effort. I don't work in a prophetic environment. I work in, here's a Greek word, anybody can go look it up. Here's what it means. And I try to understand the grammar and syntax of the way that sentence works, and then I translate it that way.
And Joseph Smith, of course, wasn't using those objects when he was engaging the Bible, right? He was actually he was actually engaging Sidney Rigdon and the broader Restoration as well, and also evangelical understandings of the Bible through the Adam Clark commentary.
Yeah, and he owns a Finney printing of the King James Version of the Bible, 1828. The Bible still survives, and we know he was marking it, and he was writing notes and things in the margins, etc. So
Yes.
yeah.
Very interesting. So I wanted to ask you, Thomas, the Gospel of Thomas is I now, and if I'm a little rusty, it's been a while since I've engaged modern about biblical scholarship, but Gospel of Thomas is more of a sayings of Christ text, isn't that correct? It's more of just sayings. Okay. And there was a time when it was first found that people thought that maybe that was Q. Was that correct?
There was some initial excitement over that. It does have some of the Q sayings, but a small number of them. Off the top of my head, I don't remember the exact number, but yeah, there are some sayings that are quoted in the Gospel of Thomas that are arguably from Q. But I think that position was quickly dismissed, that whether Thomas is Q, but another source aware of it is the way we would say it.
And I'm just curious because you had mentioned you have done some work on how was it the Gospel of John and the Gospel of Thomas? You say there was interactions there. Can you maybe describe to tell your hypothesis on that? I'm fascinated by that.
Oh, absolutely. So in the late 90s, one of the things that we used to say quite a bit, which has fallen on hard times recently, is the idea that we have communities that are defined by the text, like the Markan community.
Mm-hmm.
Is this community that reads Gospel of Mark, or we would say Pauline churches. And so what I argued is that the Gospel of Thomas, it had a community, the Thomas community and the Matthean community, and that these two communities were in conversation in particular about the role of Christian teachers and whether Christian teachers should be charismatics or not, or whether they should be kind of structurally appointed within the community and become part of, if you will, to use a Latter-day Saint term, part of an office or a calling or an assignment, where the Thomas Christian teacher might view him or herself as anointed by the Holy Spirit and could speak extemporaneously to truth, but might not the next meeting be that teacher. And so I was arguing that they're having these conversations between one another, and that's really what I did some early work on.
Hmm. Wow, that sounds really cool, dude. Sounds like you've had a fascinating career, and you've contributed a lot, and I think you're making a very important contribution to the conversation in many ways between the evangelical world and the Latter-day Saint world. I think this is good that you're talking to scholars outside of your tradition and engaging people from mine. I think that's just a wonderful thing, and that's part of the purpose of this channel too, is just to get people talking to each other and get people on who are talking to each other as well. Thomas, I want to thank you so much for coming on. You're a trailblazer, and I'm so excited that you came on the show today.
Hey, thanks, Steven, for having me. It's been great, and hopefully I helped a little bit in this world here.
Yeah, I think so, and I think it's good to have to have, and also you educated the audience a lot on modern scholarship, and I think that's good for people to understand the scholarly world as well. I think that's just, it's good to know things, folks. It's good to be fully informed, right? And I think that's the key thing. So this is the book, The New Testament, a translation for Latter-day Saints by Coppered Books, translated by Thomas Wayment. And I'm going to leave links in the description for those of you who'd like to purchase the book. I heartily recommend it. I think it's a great thing for people to study. And also, I think that for the evangelicals out there that watch your show, this also might be a good way of engaging the restoration as well, is through this text and see where they're coming from. And you'll find that this is a pretty solid, from my understanding, and I've read a little bit to some other people, and they tell me that the translation seems pretty solid. So I think that it seems like you done good there. And so really excited. And just a reminder, folks, there's links in the description for those of you who would like to purchase things from our merch store. You can get hot chocolate mugs. You can get t-shirts, hats, you name it. It's all there. Also, for those of you who like to financially contribute to the program, there's links there if you want to support us on Patreon as well as on PayPal. And also, we are working on getting the podcast audio format up to date. So keep an eye out there. We are on iTunes and Spotify. We're a little behind. About 80 to 90% of my audience is watching on YouTube. So that is our main focus. But we are building our audio podcast as well, which is growing quickly as well. But I just remember, folks, I just want to remind you, the most important thing is this. All the voices of the restoration will be heard here on Mormon Book Reviews.